Good evening. The Reagan-Gromyko meeting was the top story today. The president and the Soviet foreign minister had what the U.S. side called a calm, deliberate, and businesslike meeting. Gromyko and Secretary of State Shultz set another meeting for tomorrow. President Reagan called Jimmy Carter to say he wasn't blaming the former president for the Beirut bombing. The government's index of economic indicators rose, easing fears of a recession ahead. Jim Lehrer is off. Judy Woodruff's in Washington. Judy?
We spend most of the NewsHour tonight on U.S.-Soviet relations, one of our special issue and debate segments on perhaps the most critical topic of the presidential campaign, nuclear arms control. A top advisor to Walter Mondale and a senior Reagan administration official debate the policies of the two candidates. Then two party leaders from the state of Washington discuss how that's playing with the voters. Our regular political analysts, Alan Barron and David Gergen, join us to react to the events of this busy campaign week. And we have a look at the way some newspaper editorial cartoonists size it up.
The MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is funded by AT&T, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and this station and other public television stations.
Today marked the end of an historic week in the presidency of Ronald Reagan and a dramatic one in his election battle with Walter Mondale. It began with Mr. Reagan's speech to the United Nations General Assembly, laying down a conciliatory approach to the Soviet Union quite at variance with some of his earlier rhetoric. It culminated today in Mr. Reagan's first personal contact with the Soviet leadership he has so bitterly attacked for many years. It was a week in which Walter Mondale said Reagan was shifting his policies just to get votes, and in which many Democrats denounced the president for appearing to try to shift responsibility for the bombing of the Beirut embassy. Tonight we look at these issues. Judy?
It was the day long awaited at the White House, the all-important meeting scheduled just 5.5 weeks before the presidential election, at a time when Mr. Reagan is doing all he can to improve U.S.-Soviet relations after several years of making anti-Soviet rhetoric one of his trademarks. The Soviet foreign minister arrived at the White House at 10 o'clock, where he was greeted by Secretary of State Shultz. As their Oval Office meeting began, reporters tried to get the president to respond to Walter Mondale's assertion yesterday that significant progress was possible at today's meeting. Mr. Reagan refused to comment, but Mr. Gromyko took the question, saying he was hopeful. After 2 hours of discussion, the Soviet and American entourage left the Oval Office for lunch, but Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gromyko remained behind for an 8-minute personal conversation. As they walked to the state dining room, reporters asked whether they were making progress. Mr. Gromyko smiled, and Mr. Reagan said, "We're talking." Sitting across from each other at lunch, the two men were overheard to discuss hunting, which Mr. Reagan said he didn't do much of, and Mr. Gromyko, speaking in English, said he enjoyed with his son. As he left the White House around 1:45, Mr. Gromyko joked with reporters. Earlier, he had promised to answer 1,000 of their questions after the meeting.
Next time, we'll answer 4,000 questions. Will there be a next time?
According to one report by the Associated Press, throughout the day, Mr. Reagan appeared somber and serious, but polite, while Mr. Gromyko adopted a posture that suggested a combination of weariness, boredom, and indulgent exasperation with all the hoopla that surrounded his visit. Robin?
Mr. Reagan left comment and analysis of his first encounter with the Soviet leadership to Secretary of State Shultz, who said the meeting definitely advanced the cause of peace. Schultz said the president and Gromyko discussed arms control, human rights, Lebanon, the Iran-Iraq war, and the Palestinian issue. He says Gromyko expressed his views powerfully and aggressively.
The meeting was a very strong personal interchange between two individuals. And while some others had occasional things to say, it was very basically a meeting between two men. The president's purpose was to put forward to Mr. Gromyko, representing the top level of the Soviet leadership, the president's view that we need to have a more constructive relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, the meeting definitely advanced the cause of peace. And I think when you have a genuine and intense discussion between two people at the top of these two most important governments, and it is a genuine, calm, businesslike but intense discussion, that's sure to be helpful. There's lots of distrust, there's lots of apprehension, there are lots of differences of opinion, and I don't think one discussion is going to clear the air completely, but I think it undoubtedly made some progress in that direction.
To brief us a little further on the Reagan-Gromyko exchange, we have Robert Dean, Deputy Director of the State Department's Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. Mr. Dean, what happened at today's meeting to make another meeting between Shultz and Gromyko tomorrow necessary?
Well, I think, as the Secretary of State said, we had businesslike, calm, and intensive discussions today, which, in our view, and obviously in the Soviet view, warranted follow-up discussions, in which we hope to take account not only of today's meetings, but of the earlier discussions this week.
Had provision been made earlier, before today's meeting, for a possible further meeting?
We were hopeful that one could be held, but I think our view was that we would have to wait and see if the situation warranted it, and it has.
So do you, in the State Department, take that as a positive sign that another meeting was warranted?
Well, I think talking is always positive. I think one has to keep in mind at the same time that there are basic differences between us, that the divide is still great, but we have made certainly some steps forward, and we hope we can continue that process.
Will that meeting tomorrow be devoted to a specific area which the discussions covered today?
I think that all I can say, Robin, is that we will recapitulate some of the issues that we have discussed earlier in the week.
Mm-hmm. When Mr. Shultz was asked today, he didn't say anything about Mr. Gromyko's response to any of this today. I don't know whether you heard Judy quoting the Associated Press a moment ago characterizing Mr. Gromyko's demeanor. How would you describe his demeanor during the day?
Well, personally, I would characterize it as businesslike, consciously so, as an effort to maintain a calm and serious dialogue.
Yes. There was speculation beforehand that Mr. Gromyko, in his traditional pattern, would be quite tough, would lay down the law and recapitulate in very strong terms the Soviet view of American policy. Is that what he did? Did he really give it to the president on, in the tone of his UN speech the other day?
I think the speech itself clearly was a restatement of Soviet policy. We found the tone of it somewhat regrettable. We would have hoped for a more reciprocal response on the part of the Soviets. But I think it's safe to say that his tone in private discussions has been less.
Did he attempt, as has been done in the past, by Mr. Gromyko to browbeat the president, or?
No, by no means.
I see.
I don't think that's possible.
And what were Mr. Reagan's feelings coming out of it?
Robin, I really don't know. I'm afraid I wasn't part of the meetings, and I can't say. I think, as I say, the mood in the administration at this moment is hopeful. We are looking forward to tomorrow's meetings.
Right. Well, thank you. In a week of harsh public remarks about Mr. Reagan and his policies, Moscow today singled out Walter Mondale for something like praise. Commenting on Mondale's meeting yesterday with Gromyko, the Soviet news agency TASS said some ideas set out by the Democrat, if they materialized in Washington policy, would open up the possibility of bringing the two powers closer. TASS said Mondale's ideas would also open the way for subsequent agreement on arms reduction and on disarmament. Judy?
President Reagan's meeting today with Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko comes 39 days before the U.S. presidential election. Coincidence or not, that fact highlights the political reality that U.S.-Soviet relations are one of the key issues in the campaign. So tonight we are going to spend a major part of this program on this major presidential campaign issue in what we call an issue and debate segment. We start with an examination of the central aspect of the superpower relationship in the 1980s, arms control. We begin with a look at recent history, as well as at the respective Reagan and Mondale positions. The last major arms control agreement was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT II, initialed by President Carter and Soviet President Leonid Brezhnev in Vienna in 1979. A jubilant President Carter presented Congress a document he said would strengthen the limits on nuclear weapons that had been set forth in the first SALT Treaty.
When ratified, it will be a truly national achievement, an achievement of the executive and of the Congress.
Hearing will please come to order.
The Senate spent much of the summer of 1979 tediously dissecting the treaty, critics repeatedly challenging America's ability to verify Soviet compliance. Deliberations dragged on. In December, the U.S. was jolted by the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Russian troop carriers and tanks rumbled in to crush Muslim resistance and shore up a puppet regime.
I have asked the United States Senate to defer further consideration of the SALT II Treaty so that the Congress and...
President Carter announced sanctions against the Soviets, saying he now found them more dangerous than he had thought.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
This atmosphere of ill will and uncertainty coincided with the long-held views of the new president, Ronald Reagan. He vowed to restore American military power to discourage Soviet adventurism.
When action is required to preserve our national security, we will act. We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be.
But the European allies were uncomfortable with such a tough anti-Soviet stance. Partially in response to pressure from them, Mr. Reagan proposed in late 1981 to open talks with the Soviets over so-called intermediate-range nuclear missiles deployed by both sides in Europe. But it was the growing popularity and political force of the nuclear freeze movement in this country that generated the Reagan administration's most publicized effort at arms control. In a speech at his alma mater, Eureka College in Illinois, Mr. Reagan introduced the concept of START, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, talks to reduce, not just limit, nuclear weapons. A month later, the START talks began, led by a prominent opponent of SALT II, retired Army General Edward Browning. 5 unproductive rounds of START talks were held between June 1982 and December 83. The Soviets doubted U.S. intentions, calling the Reagan proposals unrealistic, stalling tactics, while the U.S. rearmed. Then, last fall, while both sets of talks continued, the U.S. went ahead with an earlier decision to deploy in NATO countries new intermediate-range missiles aimed at Soviet targets. Designed to counter a Soviet buildup of modern SS-20s aimed at Western Europe, the new Pershing and cruise missiles had been requested by the NATO allies during the Carter administration. With public opinion in Europe strongly divided over the missiles, the Soviet Union launched a propaganda drive to discourage installation of the new weapons. When that failed and the missiles went in, the Soviets walked out of both the START and the European missile talks. So what is the status of arms control efforts now? On the START talks, there have been no negotiations since last December. On the European missile talks, nothing since November. On 2 existing Nixon-era treaties to limit nuclear testing, no Senate ratification, no talk since 1980. Proposed Soviet-American discussions on weapons in outer space were to begin this week. They did not, and probably will not soon. Restraints on chemical weapons, no bilateral talks in 4 years. On reducing conventional forces in Europe, talks continue, no agreement in sight. One ray of hope, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed this summer to upgrade the hotline between Moscow and Washington. In the meantime, both nations continue nuclear testing, continue to research and develop new weapons, continue to deploy new and improved strategic arms. This week, the presidential candidates focused their campaigns on arms control. President Reagan used the United Nations to speak in conciliatory tones to the Soviets.
We're ready for constructive negotiations with the Soviet Union. We recognize that there is no sane alternative to negotiations on arms control and other issues between our two nations, which have the capacity to destroy civilization as we know it.
Mr. Reagan addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York on the subject of foreign policy and how we all welcome those new soothing words. Gone is the talk of nuclear warning shots. Gone is the talk about winning nuclear war. Gone is the evil empire. After 4 years of sounding like Ronald Reagan, yesterday morning he tried to sound like Walter Mondale.
To explore further the differences between Reagan and Mondale on arms control, we have senior officials from both camps. Robert Dean from the State Department, whom we met a moment ago. David Aaron, a member of the National Security Council staff under President Carter, is Walter Mondale's chief foreign policy advisor. Starting with you, Mr. Aaron, of the differences between you and President Reagan on arms control, what is the most significant one? What does it boil down to in your view?
I think it boils down to a genuine commitment to really halt the arms race. Right now, we have a situation in which there have been no talks, as your monitors indicated, and in which we're moving so swiftly into the era of space weapons without any real negotiations going on between the two sides, that these deployments will undermine existing treaties, such as the ABM treaty, and they will make impossible the deep reductions that Mr. Reagan has asked for. In other words, the space weapons issue is a very fundamental one between the two sides because of its devastating impact on the hope to control arms.
Mr. Dean, from the administration's point of view, what is the fundamental difference between you and Mr. Mondale on arms control?
Robin, I think the issue before this nation is and has been for the last years the preservation of the nuclear balance between the two superpowers. That preservation can only be found in a combination of forced modernization, which any administration would be duty-bound to undertake, and a policy of serious arms control proposals designed to channel the so-called arms race into more constructive, less destabilizing directions. It's a policy that we regard in the mutual interest of both the United States and the Soviet Union.
Mr. Aaron, a voter listening to this is very interested in the subject, but perhaps a bit bewildered by the detail, might ask himself, well, they're both talking about making some kind of good deal with the Russians about arms control. Maybe Mr. Reagan wasn't, but he is now. They're both talking about that. What's the difference?
Well, I think the difference lies, first of all, in the history. Mr. Reagan has opposed every arms control agreement put forward by every president since Eisenhower. He was against the limited test ban treaty, and if he had his way, we'd still have strontium-90 in our milk. He was against the non-proliferation treaty, he was against SALT I, SALT II, the ABM treaty, and so forth. So there's a record here, and there's a history. The second issue comes down to a question of what do you want to do with the arms race? Do you want to stop it? Do you want to curb systems that now coming on board could be devastating in their consequences for the very nuclear stability that Mr. Dean is talking about? Or do you want to legalize these? Now, as far as we can tell, it's the proposition of the Reagan administration that space weapons should be legalized and controlled and somehow brought on board for both sides. This is a very dangerous philosophy.
Let me put the question the other way around to you, Mr. Dean. Why shouldn't the voters say, well, Mr. Reagan's talking about getting a deal now, but he hasn't been for a long time. Why shouldn't we let Mr. Mondale try?
We have sat with the Soviets for over 2 years in negotiations on both medium-range nuclear systems and strategic systems. We have presented to them in complex detail 2 intrinsically logical proposals which would result in reductions of nuclear weapons on both accounts. The fact is that the Soviet Union walked away from the table, in our view, for political reasons having to do with the deployment of new American systems in Europe, a deployment which we regard as a victory for the Atlantic Alliance and the cohesion of that alliance. We have been in an unusually politicized situation with respect to arms control over the last 3 years.
Yeah. Well, how do you, that boils down to the Russians haven't wanted an agreement now for one reason or another. Why would Mr. Mondale do any better than Mr. Reagan at getting one?
The issue is, how do you challenge the Soviets to negotiate seriously? You never know if they're going to negotiate seriously. They always negotiate toughly. Now, it's pretty clear that when the administration waits more than a year to get back on the negotiating track after it entered office about European missiles and about strategic missiles, and when it does so, it finally comes forward, it makes a proposal, and then it brags that it was a propaganda proposal, the famous zero option that was put forward. We open ourselves up for political manipulation by the Soviet Union because we undermine our own credibility. It is very important that our proposals be serious and complete. And I think that many keen observers of this situation, including our allies, looking at the proposals we put on the table, feel that we opened ourselves up for this kind of political warfare by the Soviet Union.
You're saying that the reason there aren't any talks is the Reagan administration's fault. Is that what you're saying?
I believe that is correct. I think it takes 2. However, first of all, there's no excuse for the Soviets walking away from the table. No excuse for that. And the purpose of Mr. Mondale's meeting with Mr. Gromyko yesterday was to make precisely that point. But on the other hand, it is also very dangerous to treat these negotiations in a political manner. They have to be dealt with in a substantively solid way, and up until now, that hasn't been the case.
Excuse me, if there's no excuse for the Russians walking away from the table, then is it still the Reagan administration's fault that they did?
I think there's blame on both sides.
You know, Mr. Dean?
Well, there are some who advocate making concessions to the Soviet Union to bring them back to the table, which in our view would be rewarding them for walking away and for their intransigence. It's not a course that we consider prudent or sound. We think that in future, the Soviet Union will reconcile itself to the fact that both sides have to engage in serious negotiations on nuclear armaments reductions.
But Mr. Gromyko said the other day in his speech at the United Nations that the Reagan administration would have to remove the obstacles that it placed in the way of further arms talks before the talks could resume.
Well, we could engage in a chronological examination of what that phrase meant. There are some who see some change in the formulations that Mr. Gromyko chose and some progress in and of itself in those changes. I think we simply have to wait and see. We would rather take stock of what he says to us privately before we can assess the prospects.
Is this a fundamental difference, Mr. Aaron, that the Mondale camp believes that something must be offered or a gesture made to the Russians to get them back to the talks, and the Reagan administration believes they should just hold firm and not do anything and let the Russians come back when they want to? Is that putting it fairly?
No, I don't think that is putting it fairly. I think, and if I may put it unfairly from our point of view, the Reagan strategy has been that we're going to build up and we're going to conduct an arms race, and that's going to drive the Soviets to the table and make a good deal. We've now seen that an arms race does not produce an agreement. An arms race produces an arms race. Our view, Mr. Mondale's view, is that we need to take the initiative in our own interest to make concrete and serious proposals that are in our interest and put them vigorously to the Soviets. If we do that in all seriousness, and we do that effectively, we believe that we can move forward.
But isn't that just what Mr. Dean says that the Reagan administration has done?
Well, it comes down to a question of whether their proposals are serious, and we can discuss that. All I can tell you is that their proposal for the European missiles, the so-called zero option, was widely heralded by the administration as a propaganda victory. That's not serious negotiation.
Is that what the administration regarded that offer as? or proposal as?
I think it's important for the audience to realize that that proposal was a going-in position. We, in a matter of months, altered our position and told the Soviets that we would accept an equal level of missiles on both sides. That, in fact, they could choose the number of those missiles with a view to their own security, only recognize that NATO and the United States had legitimate interests as well.
May I make a point about this? I also think it's important to recognize that when a proposal was developed by Mr. Reagan's own chief arms negotiator and the head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency for an equal number deal, he fired the Arms Control Agency chief and he reprimanded his negotiator. So the history of this is very tangled. It's not very flattering to the administration, and I think that the problem that they face today is this whole question of credibility. Are they seriously interested? Is there anything in their history that shows that they're interested? And is there a possibility of real success? I hope that tomorrow the meeting will produce something.
Judy?
At his White House meeting with the president this morning, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko talked about more than arms control. To look at other aspects of the relationship between Washington and Moscow, we return to Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Robert Dean and Mondale campaign advisor David Aaron. Mr. Dean, let me start with you. Aside from arms control, how would you characterize U.S.-Soviet relations at this point? As you know, some have said that they are at their worst point since the depths of the Cold War.
Well, I think it's clear that the U.S.-Soviet relationship has deteriorated, and I think that's a process that began well before this administration took power. Clearly, the Afghanistan invasion was a body blow to the relationship. There's no question that we ought to have a more constructive relationship, and there's no question that that's what we are intent on creating.
Mr. Aaron, would you agree with the characterization?
I think that the U.S.-Soviet relationship has, to a large extent, collapsed, and I think it's very dangerous. I think we live in a much more dangerous world as a result. I'm concerned about it deeply. I think the American people are deeply concerned about it. And it is useful, however, to remember that we have been through periods in the past, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Crisis, even earlier, the whole tragic story about the Soviet takeover in Eastern Europe, of profound differences, and yet, every president, including Eisenhower and since Truman, has been able to find some way to meet the Soviets on the common ground of survival and have been able to reach some kind of arms agreement. And every administration, of course, since this one.
What about Mr. Dean's assertion that the deterioration began before Mr. Reagan took office?
There's no question that it began, I think, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That was an inexcusable thing. And, however, it is also clear that it has accelerated and that it's been exacerbated by things, trivial things, name-calling, tasteless jokes, statements that really don't deserve to be put forward by the leader of the most powerful nation in the world.
You're laying the blame directly then on President Reagan for much of the problem. Is that right?
He certainly has his share of the blame. In order to get out of this vicious cycle, it takes presidential leadership. Every president in the past has found a way, despite the fact that the Soviet Union is a difficult, dangerous, ruthless adversary, and anybody who's ever dealt with them knows that's true, but every other president has found a way forward except this one.
Mr. Dean, what about that?
Well, I think that there can be no question that the respect for this administration by the Soviet Union is probably at a very, very high point. And I think that's largely due to the president's constancy, to his legislative successes in bolstering our nuclear and conventional forces, and to the fact that he has presented a logical and convincing case to the American people that he's on the right track.
But what about, before we get to that, what about Mr. Aaron's point that there have been statements, needlessly harsh rhetoric coming from this president, jokes? I imagine he was referring to the remark the president made about bombing the Soviet Union. What about all that?
I'm glad he brought that up because I know it's a subject that is on people's minds. I think if the international politics is not made on the basis of rhetoric, that the men in the Kremlin are hard-minded, and they don't take the occasional offhand remark to heart and pick up their ball and walk home. If you pick up any issue of Pravda over the last month, you turn to the editorial page, you will see the United States and its president vilified in terms that we never would use in this country. It's really not a central issue.
Mr. Aaron?
Well, my view is this. The President of the United States has a leadership responsibility. He has a responsibility to speak for the best that's in America. He has a responsibility to express a vision of where the United States and the Soviet Union can together accomplish something. That vision has not been forthcoming from this administration. We have had quite the reverse. And I think that the President's change of tone at the General Assembly last week is an acknowledgement that the American people want a new foreign policy, that they want different leadership, and my belief is that they will, in the end, want different leaders.
And what about Mr. Dean's other point, though, that the respect for this nation by the Soviets has never been higher because of what this president has done?
Well, I mean, you know, the evidence is that the Soviet Union has, in fact, taken enormous advantage of these kinds of comments, that they have made great propaganda gains because of it, that the lack of credible negotiating on the part of the United States in the arms control area has been used to divide us from our allies, and that they have been very skillful in exploiting it. Unless you take the high ground, unless you're extremely serious, unless your proposals can command widespread support, the Soviet Union will exploit you. And unfortunately, I believe that this administration has, in fact, offered a very tempting target to the Soviets, which they have, in fact, exploited.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I think nothing could be further from the truth, frankly. I think that the alliance, the NATO alliance, now weathered probably its most major political trial in the last 25 years, in the years 1982 and 83. And we came through stronger and more resilient and more confident than we ever have been. It's a tremendous political success. It's really undeniable. And I think I could only repeat the point I made before about the respect this country has in the world generally and from the Soviet leadership in particular.
All right, gentlemen, it's a terribly important issue, and we thank you both for joining us. David Aaron in New York, Robert Dean here in Washington. Robin?
For a look at how big the arms control issue really is outside Washington, we go to the Pacific Northwest, where peace issues have traditionally galvanized voters. From Washington State, we're joined by the two-party state chairpersons, Republican Jennifer Dunn and Democrat Karen Macchioro. They're with us tonight from the public television studios of KCTS in Seattle. Ms. Macchioro, how significant is this issue to the voters of Washington State in this election?
It's a very important issue here.
How are you feeling that?
Well, we've seen the peace movement galvanized here. They're out registering voters. It's going to be a key race, a key issue in at least one one congressional race, and I think it's also can have an impact on our Get Out the Vote efforts in November.
You think it's really going to result in more voters coming out than would if this issue weren't hot?
Well, it certainly has been very instrumental in a lot of voter registration already.
Ms. Dunn, I beg your pardon, go ahead.
And I think these people that have been registered are people who are interested in the peace issue. It's also had a tremendous influence on other groups. Mondale has been endorsed by the nurses, by the Women's Political Caucus, many organizations that the peace issue is the reason for this endorsement.
Yeah, from a Republican perspective, Ms. Dunn, do you agree with that? Is this a big issue into Washington State voters in this election?
Robin, I would say that in Washington State, certainly as in every other part of this nation, probably the most important issue in this campaign will be the economic issue. When it comes, though, to the point of the issue of peace and nuclear arms reduction, we are seeing a couple of things happen in this state that can be factually representative of how our voters will go. For example, last fall, in a state where we had the leadership of a strong foreign policy, strong defense-minded senator, Scoop Jackson, Dan Evans, who supported the president's program, was elected to take his place against a Democrat who supported the Mondale proposal. The other fact would be that recent polls that I've been privy to that have taken a pulse here in the state of Washington have shown us that this president, President Reagan, is far more highly regarded in his ability to produce a strong set of negotiations and a strong agreement with the Soviets.
Do you agree with that, Ms. Macchioro?
Well, polling that's
Do your
been
polls
done-
show the same thing?
No, polling that's been done here shows that somewhere between the high 60s and the early 70s percent of the people support the nuclear freeze. Polls that have been done in the various congressional districts show that people here are opposed to the germ warfare. They're opposed to the armament policies of this president. Obviously, there's no doubt that if the election were held today, Ronald Reagan would carry this state. But I happen to think that he's on the wrong side of the issues, and as those issues begin to be discussed in the campaign, I think that these issues are going to be very instrumental in the Democratic Party carrying this.
What about the phenomenon that's often written about, Ms. Macchioro, that while voters disagree in a majority with Mr. Reagan on policies, they seem to support him personally so much that it doesn't make a difference? How do you see that from your state level on this issue of war and peace and arms negotiations?
Well, I guess what I see is that's what campaigns are about. And tying these issues to Ronald Reagan is what we're about to do here. And I think that what I guess I would say is our tradition has been a progressive one. The peace movement is strong here, and both the Democratic Party, independents, and moderate Republicans in this state support Mondale's position on this issue. We have till November to see what happens.
Ms. Dunn, polls have also shown that a lot of voters, whatever their party affiliation, have been disturbed by the failure to have negotiations, by this administration to get negotiations going. Is Mr. Mondale in your state making any inroads with this issue?
I don't think he is, Robin. I think that most voters realize that it was the Soviets and not we who walked away from the tables, negotiating tables in Geneva, and that we have made effort after effort to invite them to return to those tables, that certainly this president would love to be the president who set up negotiations leading to a long-term peace. I think that the voters understand that, and I think that that's why, in addition, of course, to the whole raft of reasons why they support this president, that they'll vote for him in Washington State in 1984.
What's your view of that, Ms. Macchioro? Do they understand it the way Ms. Dunn just put it?
Well, I think that the issue is going to be, what's going to come down to whether or not the average person here feels that they have made a good faith effort, and whether they want to support someone who has had no negotiations during 4 years. And it doesn't make any difference if they say that we've had 3 different Russian leaders in the last 4 years. Gromyko has been Foreign Secretary of the Soviet Union since John Kennedy. And obviously, in fact, the change of Russian leadership would seem to me a better reason that we should have sat down and talked with somebody over there. I think the average person here is very sophisticated when it comes to these kinds of issues, and I think that they see this very clearly.
Okay. Well, thank you both of you very much for joining us from Seattle this evening, and we must move on. Judy?
President Reagan was still grappling today with the aftermath of not just last week's bomb attack on the U.S. Embassy Annex in Beirut, but also his remarks about it. He placed a phone call to former President Carter to say he never meant to imply the Carter administration was to blame for the incident. On Wednesday, the president had suggested that a deterioration of intelligence gathering during the years before he came to office was partly responsible. Yesterday, Mr. Carter reacted bitterly, calling the suggestion personally insulting and saying Mr. Reagan's own policies were to blame. Today, a White House official said the president told Mr. Carter in a 4.5-minute conversation he was not suggesting the Carter administration was responsible, but that he could understand how the former president might have misunderstood his remarks. The official described the call not as an apology, but an explanation. Robin?
The American Embassy in Lima, Peru was attacked early today by 3 gunmen who fired automatic rifles at the windows. Some windows were broken, but there was no other damage, and nobody was hurt. Only the Marine Guards were in the building at the time. A Maoist group called Shining Path has been fighting against the government in Peru, and it's thought likely that the attack on the embassy may have been associated with President Reagan's meeting yesterday with President Fernando Belaúnde Terry of Peru. The attack on the American Embassy Annex in Lebanon was one of the subjects that the syndicated cartoonists commented on this week, and as it's Friday, it's time for our regular look at how they saw that and other stories, including the presidential campaign.
1,000 miles or one suicide bombing, whichever comes first.
Jimmy Carter is presiding over the humiliation of America. Hey, what can you do? Well, hi, Andre. Well, what did you think of my speech? I thought it went quite well, don't you? I mean, it was upbeat and positive. I thought I came across very well, really. The sincere seeker of peace. Well, darn. I don't think this thing is working, Andre. We better try another elevator, I guess.
So then Constantine says, we're outlawing the U.S. Bombing begins in 5 minutes.
Yes, they're very peaceful. Reagan nodded right off, and Gromyko is still asleep from his meeting with Mondale.
The deficit, the arms rate, and Central America.
Flag.
Medicare, exports, and the Mideast.
Family and faith.
Interest rates, hunger, and acid rain.
The Olympics. Who says I'm afraid to debate?
Look, let's show some unity around here. When I say something, you repeat it. Deficit.
Deficit.
Taxes.
Landslide.
The sun is rising. Coffee brewing. A pickup truck going down a country road.
McDonald's.
Puppies in a wagon. Chickies in a barnyard. Black and white kids playing in a fire hydrant. Nope. Pepsi. Surprise party for Grandma. Small town 4th of July parade. Ethnically mixed construction workers eating lunch together, laughing.
Or maybe Kodak.
President Reagan, when you care enough to vote the very best.
My God, the president's been hallmarked.
Our other regular Friday feature is a look at the campaign week through the eyes of political analysts Alan Barron and David Gergen. On the off chance you haven't seen them here before, Democrat Alan Barron publishes a bi-weekly political newsletter, the Barron Report. And Republican David Gergen is formerly assistant to President Reagan for communications, now with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. First of all, gentlemen, who gets helped the most for having met with Foreign Minister Gromyko? Alan?
Well, I think you have to say that it's credit to President Reagan because his certainly any effort that he makes in the direction of moving toward peace or giving that impression looks good. His strength has not been foreign policy. Terry Dolan, the head of NICPAC, has just gone into the polling business, Conservative Political Action Committee, and he released a poll today that asked people what they liked about President Reagan, and the two bottom, it was a tie for last place. One was at 3%. One was people who liked his foreign policy, and the other was people who liked his movies. They were tied at last place, so foreign policy is not his strength.
Well, David, do you think Mondale was helped at all, though, by having had a meeting?
Modestly, but I think Reagan was helped more. The White House point of view, Judy, is that Reagan was helped both diplomatically and politically this week. They think diplomatically, Gromyko had a chance as a leading Soviet to come in and size him up and came away feeling that he was a man who was competent, and he wasn't an easy mark, and yet he was constructive. Politically, their feeling is they have seen in their own polls this week, as late as last night, that Reagan's approval rating in foreign policy has gone up during the week. People think that he have a higher view of his ability to negotiate with the Soviets. But, you know, it's not just the change in numbers. What also has happened politically is that Reagan has taken the issue away from Mondale that he's a man who won't talk to the Soviets. Mondale,
but isn't it somewhat transparent, though, that here we are 5 weeks, 5.5 weeks before the election, and he's furiously backpedaling through a lot of rhetoric that was very harshly anti-Soviet?
Well, I think that's been a misunderstanding, and frankly, it hasn't been as well understood as it should have been in some of the press reporting. January 16th of this year, Ronald Reagan made a very constructive speech, which was quite similar in nature, quite similar in tone to the speech that he made here at the UN this last week.
I think the issue is, I think when Ronald Reagan went into the White House, it was my distinct impression from everything that was said, was that any kind of a treaty the Soviet Union would sign and find to be in its interest to sign would almost be a prima facie case that he wouldn't. Now, that's the impression, at least mine. Now, that may have changed. I think he certainly no longer sees the world in clearly the terms that he did when he came into the presidency. And if this conveys that as reality, it's fine. You just don't know. It may not. Certainly, it's a different attitude than when he became in as president. It may be theater. I don't know.
I don't think that's true. I think what's happening is that Reagan came in very wanting to work with the Soviets, but feeling there was an imbalance in the arms, and that had to be addressed early on. And the early years were spent trying to redress the imbalance he felt was out there. He felt after 3 years that we were in a much better position to have good bargaining with them, and that's what brought I think the rhetorical changes at the turn of this year.
But David, this is someone who opposed the Nixon agreements and opposed the agreements by every president, and so you have to start with some question.
He's quite consistent on that. What he wants to do is to lower the number of arms. He has felt for some time that SALT II allowed the arms race to continue and the arms to be built up. What he's looking for is some reduction.
Well, you do what you can. He's saying that Nixon and all the presidents since Eisenhower didn't negotiate.
But politically, you're saying that he benefits from this. The public is buying this argument that there's been a genuine there's a genuine feeling that's behind all this, and it's not just a pre-election conversion.
Well, not everybody in the public is, and that's clearly true. I happen to feel he didn't need this for political purposes in order to win this election. But I do think that the public feels he has been more consistent than Allen feels he has been. I think people see some consistency in the policy.
All right, let's talk about the other incident of the week. How badly hurt has the president been by this attack on the American embassy in Beirut and by some of the comments that he's made afterwards?
Well, I think he was starting to be hurt. I think the phone call to President Carter today was a very good move and another indication of what Ronald Reagan's strength is, I think, more than anything else. I think he makes as many mistakes as other politicians, and I think he cuts his losses very quick, whether it's this or even Lebanon itself, saying the troops were critical to Israel's survival and peace in America, and then pulling them right out. You know. Now,
but the statement about the kitchen,
the statement about the kitchen, I think that
delay.
was, I think that was not a good statement on his part. But you know, he's made statements before that trees cause as much pollution as automobiles and all kinds of things, and that's, I don't think, critical.
So once again, the Teflon presidency is at it again. I mean, is that it?
I think it's not rhetoric. People are watching what his strength is. I want to tell you, all the great communications he has, all the great skill and all the great charm, if the men were still in Lebanon fighting, if he hadn't backed down and pulled away and surrendered in Lebanon, if the economy was, frankly, like it was 2 years ago, he could smile a great deal more and wouldn't have as many votes.
I think he's getting a lot more credit. I think his policy is more successful in Lebanon than Allen is willing to concede. But I think the critical point on this one is, I don't think it was Reagan's. I would concede on the kitchen statement. That might have been better phrased. On the one about the intelligence community and the changes, he made a statement which he feels to this moment was correct, and that is that the intelligence community did deteriorate, and he is in the process of rebuilding. We'd be in better shape if we had not gone through this deterioration. What happened was that after he made his statement about that, one of his campaign aides, who was had not checked in, made an unfortunate statement and said he was talking about Carter, and that's what upset Reagan, because he put a gloss on what he had said that he felt was totally inaccurate, and that's not why he felt he had to call Carter, which he did this morning.
Let's talk about the bottom line. The poll, here we are, a little more than 5 weeks away. The polls still show 15, 20, 25 points separating Mondale and Reagan. Is there anything Mondale can do at this point, or several things Mondale can do, and we've got to answer quickly, to turn things around? Is the debate going to be it for him?
Well, I think the debate is I think, critically, But it's not. It's people, they view these candidates and they'll make a decision. It's not something you can do, I don't think, in 6 weeks in a presidential race. It's all that you do in this campaign is expose yourself as much as possible with the best case to the public, and they're going to decide. But it's not a boxing match in which you can strike a blow to the other candidate.
I don't agree with that.
Does Reagan have it locked?
Not yet, nearly. But I do think that Mondale not only would have the opportunity with the debates, which I think could help him. I think he ought to shake up his campaign. I think he ought to consider the possibility of a national address to the country, to restate what his candidacy is all about, to buy the time, to change his strategy. The present strategy is clearly not working.
Mr. Mondale, are you listening? You just got some advice from the opposition. Thank you both, Alan Baer and David Gergen, for being with us.
Thank you.
Robin?
There was mostly good news on the economy today. The government's index of leading economic indicators, which predicts future growth in the economy, rose about 0.5% last month. The August gain followed 2 consecutive monthly declines, which had some economists predicting a recession next year. White House press spokesman Larry Speakes discounted recession fears today, saying today's figures help ensure continued economic growth in the months ahead. Some pessimists remain, however. Roger Brimmer of Data Resources, a leading Boston-based consulting firm, predicted low economic growth accompanied by rising unemployment next year. In another economic development, the Commerce Department reported that the nation's trade deficit hit $9.9 billion in August. That was 30% lower than the record $14 billion deficit posted in July. But the year-end outlook remains bleak. Analysts predict the trade deficit for all of 1984 will hit a record of $130 billion. Wall Street took today's news negatively. The Dow Jones average of 30 industrial stocks closed down just over 10 points at 1206.71. In Florida, it's been one of the worst weeks in memory for the state's vital citrus industry, which has been hit with a series of natural disasters. Reporter Dana Peck of Florida Public Television in Tallahassee has a report.
Last Christmas, a killer freeze swept through Florida's citrus belt, damaging more than 250,000 acres of groves. Then another deadly enemy, the Mediterranean fruit fly, surfaced in Miami's Little Havana. Now an unknown strain of citrus canker poses the most fearsome menace to Florida's #2 industry.
You could see it the length of the row and the leaves all in the rows and cankers big as my thumb on the side of the plants, and it just felt like it was going to reach out and grab you just like that, you know. Really, it was absolutely terrible.
In a desperate effort to contain the canker, Florida's Agriculture Commissioner Doyle Connor ordered all infected nursery seedlings to be burned. It's impossible to track and locate all suspect plants. Some nurseries sold seedlings at random to retail stores and homeowners. So far, mature trees and seedlings planted in groves are free of canker.
Burning the trees is a hard pill to swallow when you've got a beautiful young tree and shows no signs, but it's an insurance premium that we're just going to have to do in order to ensure this thing is eradicated and eliminated just as quickly as possible so we can get back out into normal business.
The federal government banned fresh fruit shipments to all citrus-producing states. Ironically, since Florida is a citrus producer, Floridians can't buy their own fresh fruit. However, the shipment ban should not affect Florida's citrus juice business.
Well, we're in the recovery stage from the freezes, but the canker situation does not impact at all on the supply as things stand now. The only way it could impact on supply would be if it got in the groves, and got in the groves in a very widespread way.
In fact, the ban on fresh fruit shipments may provide more orange juice for the American consumer.
That the way that the media has shown this canker thing is that it's going to create some shortage of orange juice on a short-term basis, and it will curtail the shipment of fresh varieties, but those fresh varieties that are normally sold in fresh channels. But those varieties would probably be diverted to process, so that in fact you could end up with more juice in processed channels rather than less.
Floridians, especially those who depend on citrus for a living, are reeling from repeated, uncontrollable attacks on their future and are wondering what could possibly happen next.
In South Florida, there's always been a fear that hurricanes can actually blow the trees out of the ground, or they can create enough because they have a shallow root system, or it can create enough water problems that the trees will die from flooding. But you know, you can have droppage or because of wind damage. But from the canker standpoint, one of the concerns is that this canker thing could be spread by a hurricane, because canker is spread by wind and water.
Thursday morning, Tropical Storm Isidore, packing 50-mile-an-hour winds, brushed the south coast of Florida. Isidore's wind and rain threatened to spread the dreaded canker disease to what is left of Florida's citrus groves.
Tropical Storm Isidore is causing heavy rains across most of Florida. The National Hurricane Center says the storm's current track would take it back out over the Atlantic Ocean later this evening. Judy?
Turning now to a recap of today's top stories. President Reagan and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko met for 4 hours today at the White House. Secretary of State George Shultz said the two leaders had what he called an intensive exchange of views. They agreed that the U.S. and Soviet Union should stay in touch, a task made easier by the announcement after the Reagan-Gromyko meeting that the Soviet diplomat will meet tomorrow for the second time this week with Secretary Shultz. In other news, President Reagan called former President Jimmy Carter today to say that he did not mean to imply cuts in the CIA during the Carter administration were responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut last week. Yesterday, Mr. Carter criticized Mr. Reagan for a statement about CIA cuts made while campaigning in Ohio on Wednesday. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Judy. That's our news hour tonight. Have a nice weekend, and we'll see you on Monday night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
The MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour is funded by AT&T, reaching out in new directions. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and this station and other public television.